This is James Lupton, delighted to be joined with Ollie McManus. Ollie, mate, long time no speak. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all good, James. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Wanted to get you on. I bet your notifications were going wild yesterday. Everyone and anyone was reporting your story. You was at the courts with Bomac, Brian McIntyre, trainer of Terence Crawford and Chris Eubank Jr., plus others, for his gun offences. I won't go too much into it because I'll be honest, I don't know an awful lot about it. So I'll let you go into the details. Um,
Yeah, no, really interesting case to be fair. Ultimately it was fairly simple in that he was found with a gun flying out from Manchester Airport in a zipped compartment of the bag. It wasn't detected for whatever reason on the way in. It was only really flagged because the baggage handler thought it was a laptop initially and just wanted to do further checks. And Brian McIntyre, the basis of the plea, so he pleaded guilty on the basis that he had packed it for a training camp in America and simply forgotten to take it out. Prosecution accepted that he didn't intend to bring it into the country, and there was body cam footage from the police showing his reaction to when the firearm was found. And on that basis, it was found that there were exceptional circumstances that warranted mitigating the mandatory prison sentence that otherwise he could have faced. So interesting, but to be fair, pretty straightforward given the circumstances.
Absolutely. You mentioned the mandatory prison sentence is a 5-year sentence, but down to circumstances and the situation, he was, he got away with not serving a 5-year sentence, of course. Talk to us a bit about why the character references provided by who came over from America and also what his sentence is. He's got a 20-month suspended sentence. What does that mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, so lots of confusion on social media about what the mandatory prison sentence actually means. Ultimately, if you are caught with certain firearms, you face a mandatory prison sentence of 5 years, unless you can prove exceptional circumstances. The judge yesterday felt that there were overwhelmingly exceptional circumstances, not least because he believed Brian McIntyre in saying that, well, he didn't realise that the gun was in his bag. The actual firearm itself, he's licensed to have in America, so he legally owns it. Obviously, he was flying out of the country back to a country where he's legally allowed to own it. We heard from Terence Crawford, who described Bomac as a father figure. Stephen Nelson, likewise, said he was cared for him like he was his own son. And all of that put together ultimately meant Judge Dean felt it was necessary to dispense of the mandatory 5-year prison sentence. But that in itself doesn't necessarily mean he was automatically not going to jail at all. The judge then still has to weigh up other factors, the culpability, the risk to determine what the sentence was. And a sentence can only be suspended if it's less than 2 years in prison. And because of Bomac's early guilty plea at the first opportunity, he got 25% off and determined a 20-month prison sentence, less than 2 years, it can be suspended. What that means really is if he comes back to the United Kingdom and commits another crime, he's liable to serve that original 20-month sentence in addition to any new sentence. It doesn't mean he's banned from the UK. Lots of people thought that automatically meant he's banned from the UK. No specific travel order, but obviously the Home Office does take into account criminal convictions when they decide on visa applications. So it could have an impact, but there's no sort of blanket ban on him entering the country.
And as mentioned, character references, Terence Crawford and Stephen Nelson, two of his fighters, came over from America to fight his corner, essentially. What was said? Do you have any sort of quotes from those two guys?
Yeah, and to be perfectly honest with you, I was speaking to someone at a Manchester Crown Court, incredibly helpful, who was saying that they've never seen so much interest in what I was saying to you, James. It's ultimately quite a boring case from a court perspective. And relatively, most of the time, character references would be done in person, such as Bob Arum. He submitted a letter in support of Bomac. But Terence Crawford, Stephen Nelson both appeared in court, which was surprising, and ultimately both sort of echoing the same thing about Bomac's work with the community in Omaha, how he's treated them, and a real worry as well that if he was to go to prison, what would happen to the gym. Terence Crawford and Stephen Nelson both sort of saying that they've looked after them as though he was their son, and yeah, it's very strong support. Clearly, shows the sort of man that he is. That was accepted by the judge, Blestein, who said he was like a clear personification of the redemptive qualities of boxing and how it helped people, through some really tough times. And he said it was a cliche, the judge, but in this situation, ultimately it is true. He made a careless and complacent mistake, but ultimately that's all it was.
So you just finally, in terms of with Bomac, you mentioned there's no travel ban. It just obviously potentially will affect a visa application in the future. But as it stands, essentially, he's been let go. He's walked out. He's on his way back to America, and there is no real implications apart from the suspended sentence. Excuse me. So as long as he doesn't reoffend, essentially, he's a free man.
Yeah, I think very much, a clean record to all intents and purposes, except the criminal conviction. But the judge himself said that ultimately it was just careless and complacent, and Bomac acknowledged that it's something he was ashamed of to cause sort of so much disruption at the airport, having not realised that the gun was in there. But I think that shows the character of the man, and I think that shone through all the character statements. And people are saying, well, why would he return to the UK? Well, it's quite simple. He's allowed to return to UK. There's no reason why he wouldn't. He's a fantastic boxing trainer. He's got plenty of working opportunities here and in America. It's an unfortunate accident which perhaps has overshadowed an awful lot of his work, especially after the Chris Eubank victory. But it is ultimately just an unfortunate incident. People also questioned on social media why he's been given a suspended sentence, why the law's been applied in the way that it has. And to be perfectly honest with you, James, there's lots of people on Twitter that think they know the way the law works, and they actually have no idea about how the law works. That the law was applied perfectly proportionately in relation to what was, albeit quite a concerning offence, a very minor offence.
Definitely. And as you mentioned as well, Brian McIntyre, he immediately displayed his shock that it was in his suitcase, pleaded guilty at the first opportunity. In terms of, from what I can see from photos and reports, he left the court in Manchester, obviously very happy, elated to be leaving, and even put on his social media today thanking the staff and everybody who he came across really during his time in a prison in Birmingham whilst he was waiting for his court date. So it seems to be it doesn't begrudge anything. It doesn't, no malice towards anybody at all. No, trying to find the word. There's no sort of bad ill feeling from Brian McIntyre for the whole situation.
And I think, again, it all comes back to, we've said plenty of times, as obviously Terence Crawford and Stephen Nelson said in court, it's the character of the man, that he is a good person and a gentleman first and foremost. I think as well, let's not forget, although it was, unlikely given the circumstances that he was going to serve 5 years in prison, it was still perfectly possible that a custodial sentence was on the table. He has been, some would say he's been treated leniently, and it is, it's a lenient sentence. But when you weigh up the factors and you look at the circumstances of this specific offence, then it's a fair decision. And I think, I think he's aware of that as well, that for what was a moment of silliness, it could have gone a lot worse for him yesterday, and he's very lucky to get a suspended sentence, given firearms offences in the UK are taken particularly seriously. But as I say, given the circumstances, it perhaps is the only outcome that sort of makes sense.
I think some of the negativity on social media regarding this leniency is because it's such a high-profile case, high-profile people involved. Would this have happened to anybody else? Let's say it was same situation. So there's another boxing coach who's helped his community out, same as the character references gave for Brian McIntyre, but it wasn't somebody who is a professional boxing trainer, somebody who is unknown. Would they still have got the same lenient suspended sentence?
Look, I mean, obviously, it all depends on each individual case. There was a case a few months ago, sort of a Mexican, I think it was a care worker. It was certainly nobody famous, and his baggage was packed by his maid. There was a gun that was found in there. Again, he said he didn't know it was in there. The judge accepted that, and he was given a suspended sentence. And that man, by no means, was famous, and he was given that sort of similarly lenient suspended sentence. It all depends on the specifics of the case. And, judges work through a very sort of specific set of sentencing guidelines. They have it's a lovely little grid that they've got to work through over culpability and risk, and all sorts of terms get bandied around in court, and the guidelines are very stringent and very specific. A judge would work through it methodically, depending on the circumstances of each case, and reach their determination. Yeah, like you say, lots of people on social media seem to think it's to do with who Bomac is, but judges are incredibly professional. They work through the sentencing guidelines line by line to determine the appropriate sentence for each case. And I've got no doubt, had the judge yesterday have believed a custodial sentence was necessary, then he would have determined that. He wouldn't have just suspended the sentence on the basis that this guy is Brian McIntyre, a boxing trainer. It is ultimately dealt with by the offence, not by the person.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you had a comparison there as well, because it does go to show that it's not a case of he's been let off with a lighter sentence because of who he is and because he's Chris Eubank Jr.'s trainer or Terence Crawford's trainer. Ollie, thank you very much for your time. I won't keep you no longer, but I appreciate a bit of insight there into the court proceedings.
No, it's been lovely. Cheers, James.